Amanda, and thanks for that discussion on such a great campaign. So welcome now to the closing session of PRovoke Global 2020. It's fitting that I expect we'll touch on many of the key themes that were threaded throughout the discussion as we explore building communities, establishing credibility, and capturing audiences, or the 3 C's, as our friends at W2O like to call it. So we're going to close the discussion as well with some bold predictions for 2021. So you're going to want to stick around for that. Also, please ask any questions for the panelists in the chat. I'm going to start by introducing the panel, and since being human has been a theme of PRovoke Global, including in this last session, I will tell you a little bit about the panelists in addition to their job titles. So we have Allie Funk, who is head of U.S. Communications and Public Affairs at UCB, which is a global biopharma company focused on severe diseases. So Allie is a recovering Washington, D.C. communicator who now lives in Atlanta and has spent much of quarantine baking unhealthy treats for her husband and spoiling her rescue dog. Lady Bell, I think is the dog's name. We also have Emily Poe, who is Chief Integration Officer at W2O Group. She lives in Austin, Texas, with her husband, 2 daughters, and now a 6-month-old puppy that they adopted during shelter in place. So we are all dog owners here. Welcome to the panel, Emily and Allie.
Thanks, Dorothy.
So, yeah, well, so let's jump in. There's a bunch we want to cover here. So let's start with this first building block, building communities with stakeholders. And I'm curious to hear from you all sort of how you or your clients or whether you or your clients put into action sort of this business roundtable philosophy of putting all stakeholders on equal footing, whether that's employees, customers, the community at large, and then also, shareholders.
Sure. So I can jump in. At UCB, really, we take kind of an approach to look at all of our audiences together. And especially during the pandemic, it's been about our people, our employees, the patients we serve, and our broader community. And that broader community includes healthcare professionals, our investors, influencers, anyone who we might come into contact as a business and in the products that we sell. And so in building those communities, we really are looking at all of them and thinking about what messages are going to resonate with those particular stakeholders and tailoring them based on their needs, but trying to have that central theme that really can drive connectivity across them.
Yeah, and I would echo what Allie says. Because we focus here at W2O almost exclusively in healthcare, patients are at the center of really everything that we do. And the other stakeholders involved in decision-making really are important primarily because of how they relate to patients. So physicians, based on how they make decisions to treat and engage with their patients, investors, shareholders, how they make decisions to fund innovation, they get treatments and diagnostics and vaccines to patients. So each of the stakeholders, we have to take into account as people, what they need to make their decisions, but fundamentally at the core, as Ali was saying, it's all about the patients, it's about the employees. And over the last few months, I think that's been even more critical as we've kind of stripped back and really focused on what's most important to communicate, because there's so much conversation, so much communication that's happening right now, and really prioritizing how we're focusing on those different stakeholders in the conversations.
So Emily, because this is a W2O session, I have to ask, what role does analytics play in sort of not only identifying these communities, but also determining, what is important to them in this moment?
Yeah, I mean, analytics, I think, has been at the core of everything that we've been doing. And it's been increasingly helpful for us over the past few months to understand how audiences have evolved and changed, because I think we all know over the past few months, every day we wake up and we really don't know what to expect, right? We don't know how the world has changed. So our analytics allow us to understand what's important to our audiences, what kind of content they're engaging with, where they're going for information, where they're finding credible information that they feel like they can act on, and then being able to determine where and when we should be inserting other parts of the conversation into what's already happening out there. So analytics has really kind of given us that environmental scan that we've needed to be agile and nimble to allow us to sort of move and guide our clients into the world that is really totally topsy-turvy. So I think, is that fair, right, Allie?
Yeah, and I think the analytics piece has always been important in finding the right audiences or the lookalikes to make sure we're getting our message out there. But during COVID, it's been even more important. And we've been relying on data from folks like W2O to understand what the media consumption trends are. Where are people getting their information? Because it's changing so quickly. Early in the pandemic, you saw this cool spike in local news. And you're like, wow, I haven't been talking about local news in forever. And suddenly this is where people are turning for the latest and greatest information. And so being able to understand where our audience are and where they're looking for more information so that our content is in the right places and it's resonating.
You know, you all both already brought up the pandemic, and I think that's an interesting question around building communities. You know, with building communities, there's this inherent expectation that it'll include some sort of in-person or like experiential engagement. And I'm curious sort of how the pandemic has impacted your ability to build a community, or has it not, because that's mostly moved online?
I mean, I don't think would be any surprise that COVID has shifted how we're communicating to and within communities, how we're building communities to be far more digital and socially focused. You know, I think that's the trend that everyone would expect. You know, before the pandemic, we were still doing in-person patient engagements, you know, physician meetings were happening in person, medical meetings, investor conferences, all were happening in person. But now, you know, it has forced us as an industry to really be much more innovative and thoughtful about how we're reaching and communicating and leveraging social and digital. You know, we've been pivoting to leveraging social and digital to help our clients launch drugs, new medicines in this environment. And they've been very successful, but it's a totally different mind shift from how pharma as an industry has launched drugs. You know, for patient ambassador activities, which, you know, when patients are getting together and explaining their treatment experience, which was largely focused around in-person activities, we've been pivoting to work with our clients to have those engagements be online, virtual, and also taking into consideration that, you know, people are having to deal with a lot in the world, and so kind of scaling back and being really targeted and thoughtful about how we are engaging, even when we're engaging online.
And I think that world of virtual events is something that we've had to adapt to really quickly. And I think we're going to continue to see an evolution as we all experience this Zoom fatigue. But one of the things that's been really an upside is when we're in person at a medical meeting or a patient advocacy engagement, we're talking one-on-one, and that in-person interaction is so meaningful. But moving online, we're able to see different analytics about those meetings, how many people are coming to our virtual booth, what content is really resonating. And so it's giving us another layer to work from in how we send out content on other channels that might be a surround sound perspective. But thinking about polling, gamifying, Q&As, things that are a totally different experience than what we might have done in person. And I think we're going to have to keep coming up with new approaches to keep our audiences engaged when we're in the virtual setting.
So let's move on to credibility, because as we've talked about so many times this week, I mean, you know, the PR industry is built on the importance of credibility, and this year has proven its value many, many times. But we are in a credibility crisis right now across so many institutions, whether that's government, media, healthcare. I mean, I think just as one example of many, I think just this week, the New York Governor Cuomo talked about the FDA and the CDC being lacking credibility under the current administration. So amid this backdrop of like eroding trust, how are you thinking about credibility in 2020? And is it different than even a year ago?
I think so. I mean, you know, a year ago, the World Health Organization, included vaccine hesitancy as one of its top 10 public health threats. I think if they were to relist that, I think 2020 it's going to be even higher and more significant. It continues to be an evolving landscape of who to believe and who not to believe. And this year, I think it really has shown that if our institutions are called into question, we need to rely even more on earned media as communicators, earned media that is credible, thoughtful, digs deep into stories, but also bringing really a diverse group of voices into the mix. So understanding kind of across communities, across industries, across types of people, bringing together all of those different voices into a conversation so that it is more than just one person kind of shouting into the wind. I think that's probably the most important piece in terms of building credibility. That's why you're seeing companies in healthcare like coming together, companies that normally compete, coming together to issue sort of vaccine pledges that they will make sure that there is appropriate clinical data before they'll allow a vaccine to be used. That I think that's something that we would not have thought about. In 2019, we wouldn't have expected that would have happened.
And I think to break through that credibility wall, we're looking at different ways to partner. I think we've done more partnership releases this year than I can think of in recent memory for that reason, because standing together gives us more credibility as an industry. We're talking about making sure that we're relying on the science, that we're making sure that everything is above board. And I think the other piece around credibility from our own channels is making sure that our leaders are out there as voices, both internally, but of course externally, and that they're kind of bringing their authentic self to the table. This crisis, the pandemic, has affected everyone in different ways, and being able to be real about that experience in the context of our business, I think helps in that third-party validation. And then when we're looking for the earned stories on the other side of it, you kind of get a full picture of who we are as a company and who our leaders are, and that together helps us build credibility.
You both mentioned earned media in your responses, and I'm curious how the role of earned media has possibly changed. And when we're talking about establishing credibility, and because as we've seen, trust in media continues to erode, and that's been going on for a while. People's consumption of media continues to be hugely fragmented. So how have you thought about earned media's role, and how has that shifted? And has it shifted more dramatically, especially this year being an election year where it seems like people are in echo chambers more than ever?
I think for us in releasing news, it's been the fact that most of our healthcare reporters are obviously focused on COVID. So when we've got non-COVID related news breaking through is especially challenging. And so being extra targeted in who we're going to, maybe where we might have gone to 5 or 10 different outlets, we're saying we're only going to go to 3, but that's really going to get us to the target audience we need to get to. And so that we're not overwhelming the reporting crew, but then being able to look at earned, owned, paid, social all together, because we need those messages in all of those environments to break through, especially given how much coverage is out there, particularly in the healthcare space right now.
Yeah, and from our end, we have been really leaning into what we call our agile analytics, which are some of the shorter term analytics that allow us to really keep a pulse on what, particularly earned media and in social, what types of stories, content is being put out there, shared, so that we aren't wasting reporters' time. We're focused on making sure that we understand what they're reporting on right now, what their audiences need, what their editors need, so that we can match stories very closely to what reporters need to do their jobs. But it's definitely been, as Ali said, tough to break through in this COVID environment. Healthcare reporters are rightfully very focused on that. And we have to be really smart and targeted and and leverage all those other channels, as Ali said, to make sure that messages that do need to get out there, people still need to have other types of healthcare content and messaging reach them, even in the midst of COVID. And we've been working with clients on programs like that, helping patients who may not be COVID patients, but are patients of other types of conditions, understand where and when it's safe for them to go back to get other types of conditions, treated, things that might not be so urgent and critical. That's been a big focus of some of the other work we've been doing.
You mentioned kind of working together with other companies in your space, kind of making these pledges, and then as well as sort of making sure that you're always sticking to the science. Are there any other ways in which you all, either as individual companies or as a sector, feel like you can help combat disinformation? And I'm curious if there's ever times where you say, no, I won't engage with this publication because it's not credible. We don't want to contribute to the noise of misinformation. Yeah, I'm curious to go a little bit deeper into that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. We actually are spending a lot of time looking at where and when engagement is valuable. In an environment where healthcare is sort of first topic of mind, and we have a lot of satirical online videos, we have our industry highlighted on Saturday Night Live, which is not so typical for us. We really have to be smart about when we say, let's not engage. We're not actually contributing to promoting accurate information. We're just engaging in an area where trolls are. So again, it comes down to understanding the credibility of outlets and different channels, as well as understanding the risk of engaging in places where you're unlikely to find friends. And there are times that we're recommending just step back, but otherwise, we think as communicators that it is our responsibility to correct misinformation, to be smart and savvy about how we are putting information not in such scientific data lay on friendly terms, but rather making it consumer friendly so that it's easier to digest. But yeah, there are times when we say, it's on SNL, just skip it, don't engage.
But what about platforms like Reddit or YouTube? I mean, where disinformation just proliferates. I know YouTube's been much more active in sort of taking it down some of these videos, but I mean, you can just find just about anything, any theory validated there, right? So I'm curious how active you all are in sort of some of these social platforms and combating disinformation there.
Oh, go ahead, Ali.
I was just going to say, I think from a company perspective, obviously policing other content is well beyond what we're going to try to do. But our best approach to combat that is to make sure that the information we're putting out there is correct, accurate, consistent, and getting into those forums where there may be disinformation. And so trying to take that, truism, forward-leaning approach and being as consistent as possible is the best way we can combat some of that disinformation individually.
Yeah, and for us, when we think about Reddit, we really do try to understand, because there are some themes that are totally full of bad information, but then there are also conversations that actually have been very helpful. So we do strategically target Reddit with some paid media, because we know there are a lot of eyeballs there. So we do want to make sure that we're correcting information in direct ways in places where there are eyeballs that we think people will be receptive to receiving.
Mm-hmm. And I want to remind the audience again, because in a few minutes we will open it up for chat. So if you have any questions, please put it in the chat function. So let's go on to sort of that final C, which is capturing audiences. And maybe we can circle back to analytics here. What role does analytics play in sort of creating content for your audiences and also evaluating the impact? And what's that mix of, using data and analytics, but also sort of relying on, human intelligence to say, hey, look, the data may not show this, but I feel like this is starting to resonate. So we should maybe go in this direction.
for us, data is the foundation of all of our owned and social outreach. And we are constantly looking at awareness, engagement, and conversion for whatever it is that our objective is. And I think what's wonderful about the digital world is that we can check on these things real time. And we've had to do some really different things this year. One is a digital recruitment campaign, right? We're hiring a number of roles. Normally, we would be out at job fairs and meeting people at events, and that's completely not possible. So we had to take a really targeted approach, build some specific messaging, and go up on a range of channels from Twitter to LinkedIn to Google and figure out what was going to work. And it's been fascinating to see which content performs best on LinkedIn, where we need video, where we need human messaging, quotes, or just kind of calls to action. And so we're using that data real time, looking at it on a daily basis, but potentially making tweaks on a weekly basis to see to make sure that we're getting to our goals. And I think there is kind of that element of, I think this is going to play well. Do we give this another couple of days to see if it sticks, or do we go ahead and refresh? And it's kind of just taking that gut check with the data as we continue to move forward.
Yeah, I would agree with all of those elements. I think right now, being able to be really fast with how we respond to what we're putting out there, and seeing how audiences are reacting is really critical. It's something that we've always done, but right now, something that a review committee approved and was put out on a channel may not have seemed like it was going to be tone deaf yesterday, and today it's tone deaf. So we really do have to use that human eye on anything that's going out right now. Emotions are running high. Everyone is frazzled. There's so much digesting of online content that we have to assume that there are going to be eyes on whatever we're putting out there, and that they might be critical eyes. So we have to be really smart about what's going out.
So when you oh, go ahead, Allie.
I was just going to build on the human element here, because I think this has been one of the things that's been really fun for our team. Is traditionally when you're putting out business corporate content, it has a very similar look and feel, but we've needed to leverage employee voices, talk about how we're responding as an employer, the work we've done in the community in response to COVID in a way that's very different than kind of the traditional corporate voice. And that's helping. And we're also being able to see how that's breaking through in analytics. And I think that will be one of the cool evolutions moving forward, is this kind of trust in the human element a little bit more from corporations as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, do you still schedule content to be released, or do you have to constantly monitoring the news cycle to make sure, like, whether you need to press pause?
We are not scheduling stuff as far out as we used to, that's for sure. I think our editorial calendar is constantly evolving. We're, something that we had a campaign around some employer content that was supposed to run all year. We've had to ramp up content about some of our employee resource groups and resources we've made available to employees sooner, and wanting to make sure that we are giving people what they're interested in at this moment. So I think it's having that content calendar and an arsenal of material to talk about, but also being really flexible and agile in how and when we deploy it.
Yeah, we had a client, I think back in, I want to say June, that asked us to put together a program for November, a social program. And I said, honestly, like, November is going to be a hot mess. And, who knows, like, the way this year's going, who knows if November even shows up. So that might be a little bit, I'm a type A, personality who loves to plan, but that seemed a little far out. So we sort of paused on that one.
So what about in terms of, I think, Allie, you had mentioned, there's different platforms that are amenable to different types of content. But, one of the most consistent things, and I think actually it was a conversation I had with someone at W2O about the fact that, so much content, so much brand content feels like an interruption right now. And the goal is to make that content feel much more organic and authentic. And we've been saying those words for a long time, but I'm curious sort of, now with all the information that we have, how are you building content that doesn't feel like an interruption? And are you finding that there are certain platforms where people are more amenable to sort of, hearing directly from a brand, or do you find that it's better to bring in a third party and to have sort of more kind of third party validated content, like, for instance, amplifying a New York Times story versus having, something that was created internally by a client?
I think for us, it's definitely both. It's making sure that we've got the stories of our own and having those third-party amplifiers and validators out there, but leveraging more of the human voice, I think, has been an absolutely critical aspect to this. Not just UCB says, but this person at UCB says, and pulling through folks from all levels. It's not just folks in the C-suite. It's our US leaders. It's our local leaders. It's folks running groups and projects, folks volunteering out in the community, and really making sure that they're the face and the voice of what we're doing, and not just kind of this corporate speak voice from above.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Of what we're doing at W2O too as a company. I mean, certainly with our clients, but even as a company, like Ali mentioned earlier, we're actively recruiting throughout all of what's been going on. And we've had to really rely on digital and social. And so we're relying a lot more on, being able to share the employee experience of working here, but from the eyes of the employees directly.
For
by ourselves.
So with an industry like healthcare, right? These are serious issues. There are lives at stake. There's not that you can't, or I guess it's harder to infuse entertainment into the content. I'm thinking of like Skittles, right, where they did a Broadway show around their candy, and it was super entertaining. And of course, the awards scenes loved it. How do you think about kind of making your content entertaining? Like, is that a factor that you take into account, or do you feel like, given the seriousness of the issues that you all are dealing with, that's not an appropriate way to go?
We usually, from our end, because we work in so many different categories, we usually take our cue from the audiences. Mm-hmm. So we typically don't use a lot of, let's say, humor in our content, because it's about, often about serious medical conditions, which usually is not that funny. But one kind of interesting example we have is working in IBS, when we really explored how the patients were interacting with each other. They were using humor. Mm-hmm. And it's not something we typically would have recommended. We were helping recruit for a clinical trial, and they were having some challenges. When we started creating content that sort of acknowledged the sort of, dark humor of the conditions, we actually were able to really increase recruitment into that trial. So, for us, we try to be mindful of the patient experience, and because each type of condition will have a different patient experience. In some cases, we can play and be a little bit more creative and interesting. In some cases, metastatic cancer, for example, we tend to keep it pretty, straightforward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would say I would love to be more entertaining in general, but we're focused on being engaging, less than entertaining, more than entertaining. And I think, to Emily's point, there are certain instances where we're able to come up with a really unique and clever approach. And it's often patients within a disease state talking about their disease state to their own community. We've done this quite a bit in our epilepsy community with some clever approaches of the crazy questions they've gotten asked about their disease and how they respond to them, that sort of thing. But honestly, during COVID, we've done much less of that, given the seriousness of trying to manage a chronic condition amidst a global pandemic.
Yeah.
So I did promise the audience that we would make some bold predictions. So let's do that quickly, and then we'll open it up to a couple of audience questions. So what do you think the lasting impact of the pandemic will have on the way we work, on the way we engage with each other? I know you all mentioned that we have you kind of pivoted a lot of your community building online. Do you think that will have a lasting impact? Do you think that we will resume in person in the same way that we did before?
I don't think that we will resume it quickly. I think that it will take a while to get back to where we were. There was sort of the road warrior badge status that I think a lot of us had, back in, let's say, February, that, now is no longer something that we're striving for as a community. And I think that smart CFOs are looking at, how much are we paying for space if the companies are successful and work is happening well with people remote. I think smart chief people officers are thinking about how do we allow our employees to continue to have flexibility to keep women in particular in the workforce during the kind of this up and down time. So I think that there will be some longer lasting changes, but hopefully in the course of the next year, we'll get back to some semblance of normal.
Yeah, and I think we're probably never going back to the normal we had in February, maybe. So figuring out what that new looks like. And I think it's going to continue evolving. And one of the things that I'm starting to think about for 2021 is we've adapted a bit to this virtual world we're living in, where we see each other on screen and everyone is remote. But what happens when we enter this hybrid model? And what does that look like from an engaging stakeholders perspective, from running a board meeting where half of the people are in the room and half of them aren't? I think we're going to find new challenges and have to find new ways to solve them. That I think will be particularly interesting. And I also have another theory that we have not seen the end of new platforms. I know TikTok wasn't new this year, but it certainly took off. But I think given the fact that there's so much virtual connectivity, we're going to continue to see new platforms come about probably over the coming years. And as communicators, we're going to have to figure out how to leverage those, where our communities are on them, and how to pull them through.
Okay, so because you mentioned TikTok, we actually do have an audience question that's related to TikTok, more about this sort of geopolitical reality. So, so the question is how are companies thinking about the U.S.-China battle over TikTok, and does that impact its credibility as a channel for brands? So, Ali, are you seeing this, and Emily, is this coming up in your conversations as well?
I'll let Emily address this one. We have not gone on TikTok, and I don't intend to.
Yes, we do pay a lot of attention to TikTok. We do not engage all that much currently on TikTok, but there are some very active, very interesting conversations that are happening there, and types of content. Physicians who are making statements and engaging. We have played with some of that with some of our clients in some very specific areas. That being said, everyone is very concerned about what's happening in terms of ownership of content, privacy. So we're definitely paying very close attention to that, particularly for those clients where we are starting to engage. We have not been all that engaged since the last few months when it's really become quite an issue, but we are paying attention to it. And I think it's, I think we will engage if there's a great business reason to engage, but everyone else is being quite conservative.
That makes me think, with everything that's coming out about, platforms like Facebook and how they use data, do you find that people are more reluctant to join these online communities or these groups on Facebook and share intimate details about their medical condition than they were maybe 3 years ago?
I will say in the US, I don't think we've seen a change significantly, but outside of the US, where people typically are less likely to share healthcare information, we do see actually sort of a growth industry around creating private patient communities. So I think there is a cultural element as well as kind of building the platform. So there are some organizations that are working with advocacy groups to create these communities for specific patients with specific conditions. And I think that's going to continue to be a trend as well, while people are concerned about how their information is being shared.
Mm-hmm. So Just checking to see. Okay, so I don't see another audience question, so we can do another prediction. You both talked about the media landscape and how saturated healthcare media is right now. It's really difficult to get a story across that's not COVID related. Do you have any, Emily, I think you mentioned that you had a client that wanted to plan out in 4 months in advance, and how that was it's not possible in today's environment. Do you have any predictions around the media and the narratives that will resonate, especially as the pandemic continues to evolve? The U.S. election is 2 weeks away, and then who knows what the news cycle will be after that. And how are you counseling and preparing your clients? I guess it's less of a prediction question, but how are you counseling your clients to think about the media landscape for the next 3 to 6 months?
In terms of counseling our clients, we are saying, just like you said, what happens in November in the United States will be a very dramatic indicator of what the next few months will look like from a news cycle. COVID is certainly not a part of the conversation. I think we see the ebbs and flows of COVID fatigue, like the Zoom fatigue that Ali mentioned earlier, in terms of what reporters are covering. But I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone to not be focused on the election, the outcome, what it means for policies moving forward, whoever is elected. So, we are continuing and actually kind of doubling down on, you have to be really tailored and targeted in your earned media strategy, because reporters have very little ability right now to cover something that's not going to be related to DC or COVID.
Yeah, I think we're taking that hyper-targeted approach, especially over the next 3 months when it's going to be so hard to break through, and making sure we're being really thoughtful and understanding that if we do have something big that we want to share, we're going to have to come at it from a lot of angles to break through. Just because, I think there's some people say, oh, I can't wait until after the election, things will get quiet. I think that is unlikely. It's going to be at least several more months of extreme discussion, no matter what happens.
Yeah, I'm somewhat surprised that people even believe that, given that this year has proven. I remember even we initially had to pivot editorially a lot of stuff in March, right, and then again in June, right, because in the U.S. we had a civil rights movement. So it just seems like this year has been unpredictable, and big media narratives that would dominate any single year has just been coming at us every few months. So going back, we have a few more minutes, and I wanted to go back to social again because of sort of this idea of kind of paid versus organic, and sort of how you do you find that organic social is effective still, or has most of your resources kind of been allocated towards paid in that area?
We definitely believe in both, because having stuff out there on our own channels organically, whether it be on the blog or on our social media channels, is so critical. But we're absolutely using paid, dark ads, targeted, you name it, to get even more targeted with our specific audiences. And I think the other element we've seen work more and more, especially this year, is more series-based content, which brings someone back to your feed when they realize you're covering women scientists week after week. They want to see what the next story is, so they're more likely to come back, even if they came in through a paid ad, for that additional organic content.
So I actually have an audience question. So Emily, if you did you want to give a quick response?
I agree with everything, Ali.
Okay. All right. Yeah, I figured. So let's go to
we can go to the other question.
Great. So this is actually a really interesting question about sort of reputation, and which we had talked about earlier. But have you seen an improvement of the reputation of biopharma healthcare as a result of COVID, or are we so polarized that what you gain on one end of the spectrum you lose on the other end?
We've definitely seen a reputational bump in the research for the industry. And I think that's I'm losing my headphone. I think that's largely driven by the focus on science as it relates to COVID and all of the work that companies are doing to try to tackle this disease. As a company that's not in the vaccine space, we still have a tremendous amount of research going on in structural genomics, things that can contribute to the COVID conversation and research. But I think that boost is driven by the scientific conversation, and we've seen that in data for the industry for years, that's something that really helps break through. People are interested in this cutting edge work that our folks are doing, and it's been hard to get it out there, and COVID has given us an opportunity to tell that story more directly to consumers and to patients about the incredible work that our scientists are doing around the world to try to find new solutions for patients, whether that be for COVID or for the numerous other diseases out there impacting folks.
Yeah, and our our hypothesis is that reputation is largely related to relevance, right? So reputation is one thing, but reputation can be good or bad, but it's really driven by how relevant is what a company or brand doing to what the audiences need. Right now, everyone's focused on healthcare. They're focused on COVID. They're also very focused on healthcare in general. So it gives us a great opportunity if we are smart about the content we're putting out and making sure that it's relevant to our audiences to increase our industry reputation as a whole. This is one of the first times in a long time that these companies in the space are household names. That drugs are becoming much more household names, not just because of advertising. So it's a great opportunity for the industry to step up and show how valuable what we're all doing is to what's happening around the world.
So I saw Paul's little square light up a moment ago. So I think we're about at time. So I just got a ping that we actually have 2 more minutes. So I'll open it up to any closing thoughts, because there is so much happening in this space right now, around reputation, around credibility, around disinformation, around, fractured communities. Is there any takeaway that you would like to give our attendees in this moment around what they can do in any of these areas, or perhaps what you are doing, especially folks that are tuning in that are in the healthcare space?
I think for us, it's continue to be adaptable, be agile. Things are changing so quickly, and be authentic. Bring through the voices of your people. Think about the people you're trying to reach, and really try to tell human stories to break through the noise. But I think who knows what the next big issue will be and the next thing we'll be talking about. I don't think any of us can predict what 2021 is going to look like. And so bringing that open mindset and flexibility, I think, is absolutely critical for our roles.
Yeah, and I think especially when the credibility of our institutions and earned media has been called into question in various segments of the population, that person-to-person authenticity and transparency is critical to rebuilding or building on credibility and sharing that information. So I think we've been doing similar things where we're very focused on having people tell their own stories in their own words and voices, and kind of taking a step back from some of that corporate type engagement. I think that's critical right now. People want it to be real. We're all like, you're seeing my house. We're all very now, I think, was the theme of the conference, and I think it's accurate.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Allie, and thank you, Emily. And I think that is a wrap on PRovoke Global 2020's content. So I will hand the mic over to Paul to wrap things up.
Thank you, Arthi. Thank you, everybody else. It's been kind of an amazing 4 days, both in terms of the technology and the content. We extended this year's PRovoke Global to 4 days. And I still feel as if, to a certain extent, we just skimmed the surface of all of the issues that are roiling our society and our profession this year. There was so much to talk about. If I had to pick out some highlights, they would include going back to the Entrepreneurs Forum when we were able to celebrate, to a certain extent, the resilience of our industry and the success of a lot of independent agencies, even in these incredibly trying times. We've been very focused both on the agency side and on the client side on the importance of diversity and inclusion, and in fact going beyond diversity and inclusion to discuss those issues of systemic racism that are at the heart of the problem. And hopefully the commitment there will be real and lasting this time. We've looked at the ways in which COVID has transformed the workplace and the relationship between organizations and their employees. We've looked at brand purpose and authenticity in these trying times. I found the Foot Locker story especially inspiring. We did a deep dive into Pfizer's role in developing a COVID vaccine, which was fascinating, with Sally Sussman. We've looked at the other pandemic, the epidemic of fake news and misinformation, our industry's role in it, and what solutions are likely. And in a related topic, we looked at techlash and how technology companies need to adapt and change in this environment. We looked at notions of fairness and objectivity in journalism with Wesley Lowery in another session that I thought was a highlight. And this morning, we took a deep dive into geopolitical issues involving China, India, globalization, nationalism, and all of that good stuff, or not so good stuff. It's been an extraordinary 4 days. I suspect that most of the people who are here right now didn't watch the entire 4-day conference. There was a lot of dipping in and out, I know. But the good news is that our editorial team has produced content on every session, and we have videos of every session going up as well. So if there's anything that you want to dive back into, the opportunity is there, and you'll be able to find it all on our website. Thank you to our editorial and content staff leads me to the final order of business, really, which is to slightly address an email I got this morning from a very good friend who was enjoying the conference and said, once again, you make it look effortless. I suspect that everybody in the public relations industry understands this, that the only way that something looks effortless is if it really does take a huge amount of effort in the planning and in the pulling together. And once again, the PRovoke media team, I think, has outdone itself in pulling together a 4-day virtual event, something we've never done before. Obviously, there are a lot of people to thank for that. Arun and Arthi, who have both been on your screen over the last few days, who really at this point are the brains trust here at PRovoke and who pulled this event together. Sarah and Patrick, our actual events team, who have adapted over the last 12 months from physical events to virtual events almost seamlessly. I think they have done so without compromising the quality of our event content at all, and in some ways improving it. And they've worked tremendously hard to do that. To Maya and Diana, our content team, who, along with our friend David Blecken, have been producing lots of stories throughout this conference and indeed throughout the year. Alessandra, our social media guru, Shusha and Celeste, who work behind the scenes tremendously hard. And while we are a small organization, we have a tremendous extended family, and members of that extended family have also contributed to this event. Thank you to Sarah Passage for her help with guest management, to Oyen for production management and show flow, James Beer and the team at 23 Digital, whose support is invaluable for all of our events and all of our content, frankly. Some new friends and partners, Theo Smith and CamberCam, Weber Shandwick's Content Plus, which was responsible for a lot of the front end. A lot of people worked very, very hard to make this event happen, and thank you so much to all of them. Thank you, of course, to our sponsors. As we've emphasized throughout the 4 days, they not only provide cash, which is very nice indeed, they also provide intellectual support in putting the program together and finding great speakers. We do appreciate the genuine partnership we have with all of those guys. Thank you to our speakers. Everybody was terrific this year. It was a great, diverse, insightful group of speakers. I enjoyed listening to all of you. And thank you very much to you, the audience. I hope that by doing this event virtually, we've given you an opportunity to sample what PRovoke looks like. And if there's any luck at all, we'll get back to doing live events, maybe by October next year. That'll be a possibility, and some of you will be able to join us in Washington. If not, I hope you'll come back to the internet and join us there. But wherever we do this, thank you very much indeed for your support and encouragement, and I hope you found it useful, interesting, insightful, and above all, provocative. Thank you very much indeed. Good evening.